Oh yeah, I dyed my hair. I keep forgetting because I don't film that often. Okay, I don't know how well it's coming across in this particular light, but my hair is like almost purple now. The color that I added was like very burgundy, and then I took the straight purple that I had and dyed the ends with it, so it's coming across, I don't know, but yeah, I've got some purpley in my hair now. That's a lot of fun. That's me. I bet you're wondering how I got here. Let me explain. I'm Liz. I'm in my early 30s, and I have a problem. This will not be an unfamiliar problem to many costumers, both amateur and professional. It occurs in the Venn diagram of overly ambitious and chronic procrastinator. I call this zone in the middle the chaos demon, because inevitably that's what I become. Between January 2nd and February 2nd, I hand-sewed a pair of 17th century smooth-covered stays, an under petticoat, a petticoat, and a shift, and made the accessories and some of the jewelry, and dyed the fabric that was used for the whole thing. Why? I don't know. But in my overachieving delirium, I took quite a bit of footage, it seems, so why don't we go back over the whole thing together? This project was made as my entry for the Foundations Revealed 2021 competition, the theme of which this year was storytelling. The prompt was to create a garment that in some way was representative of a character from a book. Because it is a long-standing favorite of mine, I chose to create a garment inspired by Ella Enchanted. I have known about the Foundations Revealed competition theme since they announced it in the spring of 2020. I had a lot of time to make this project in whatever way I wanted, and then I didn't. Some of that was because of other projects and videos that needed to be made first, but mostly it was just not doing it. Why don't we do things when we know we should? Or even when we want to? It's different for everyone, I guess, and there's a whole branch of psychology and behavioral science devoted to understanding it. So while I show you how the stays were made, I'll share some thoughts about this procrastination business. If I have done this the way that I wanted, there will be 3 or 4 videos coming out that detail distinct parts of this construction process. I'll talk about Ella Enchanted as my inspiration and more details about that reading experience in the last of these videos. But to preface, Ella Enchanted is a fantasy novel written for primary school level children. I'm willing to bet any kind of money that strict adherence to any particular time period was not high on Gail Carson Levine's list of priorities while writing this book. But I personally wanted to settle on an approximate date to direct my design choices, so I reread the book for the 5 millionth time and took some notes. Other people might come to different conclusions, and there's not actually any right answer, but I settled on the mid-17th century. I chose a garment from the Patterns of Fashion 5 reprint from the School of Historical Dress. Design number 9, the smooth-covered stays with the sleeves in watered silk from the Museum of London. Page 50 to 52 if you have the book. Today we'll be talking about the shift and the stays. Hurrah! Foundational garments! For those of you new to the history of supportive garments, stays were a precursor to the corset, but with a roughly similar endeavor of supporting mammary tissue and creating a fashionable silhouette. I'll link a helpful video Abby Cox created on the subject. Smooth-covered stays were essentially a combination of the supportive understructure we're more familiar with, but with a layer of fashionable fabric on top. These garments often included attached sleeves and do not show their boned structure from the outside. They were effectively worn as outerwear. But before we get into making the stays, we needed a shift. We all know you have to start with a shift. It's worn under the stays, both to protect the body from chafing and to protect the stays from too much sweat and dirt. Both these things make laundering corsets and stays either unnecessary or at least extremely rare. I have an 18th century shift, and even though shifts don't change much in the broad sense over the last few centuries, the mid-1600s had these gorgeous shifts with miles of gathers at the neckline and ballooning sleeves, which were worn to be visible while dressed. Since this shape wasn't strictly based on my measurements, I used a blog post tutorial, which I'll link below. But it can be summarized as follows. Just make everything wider. Just everything. I made the shift by hand because I like hand sewing linen, and I found that because the seams are all straight and the pieces are all rectangles, shifts are a nice project to work on in bed or while watching TV. And so most undergarments like shifts and chemises that I own have been made wholly or in part by hand. Burnley and Trowbridge and Willoughby and Rose have both done excellent guides on how to make your own in the 18th century style. I had the shift pretty much licked by January 8th. I didn't finish the sleeve cuffs until much later because I wanted to be able to play with the final garment for the right look before I settled on a style. So, on to the stays. I scanned, enlarged, and printed the pattern pieces from the book and took some measurements of them. I estimated that I needed to add an additional 4 inches to the stays to make them fit me. This turned out to be too much, and I ended up shrinking the pieces again on the final garment, but the first mock-up was done with these enlarged pieces, which also got extra boning channels, because if I'm adding fabric, I want to make sure that the structure doesn't suffer as a result. The first mock-up was done with my sewable tracing paper, the second with scrap linen. The scrap linen was boned with whatever boning I had lying around, and then when that wasn't enough, I supplemented it with cardboard soda boxes cut into strips. This was obviously not enough for the structure, but it was enough to get an idea of the shape and how it would fit in the final version. This was quite a lot of fun, actually. The lining is 2 layers of linen, stitched together to act as one, with the boning between the layers via the stitched channels. The boning on the original garment was a 1/2 inch wide, which is decidedly larger than I'd worked with before. I ordered a roll of synthetic whalebone in the appropriate size from Farthingale's Corset Supplies. Hat tip here to Miss Philomena for observing to me that I had misplaced a decimal point in my measurements, and I needed to order 15 meters of boning, not 1.5 meters. That'll teach me to tease Americans about the imperial system. I bought a Dremel at this point. I'd been thinking of buying one for a while, but this project finally prompted me to do it. Not only because of the boning, which was substantial, but also the work which came from some sculpting elements on the final costume, which we'll touch on in a future video. Can I just say, where has this thing been my whole life? It was amazing. We have a tiny apartment without a ventilation hood sufficient for tiny plastic particulate matter, so this portion was done outside on the balcony in -10 degrees. I briefly tried to keep warm with a space heater, only to find that these 2 appliances on the same outlet blew the fuse. So yeah, you win again, Canadian winters. I don't remember at what point I decided I was going to hand sew this entire garment, but for some reason I just didn't let go of that idea. So yeah. For a time reference, so you understand how dire the Chaos Demon energy was getting at this time, I began hand stitching the boning channels on the final stays on January 18th. With about 2 weeks to go, I hadn't even technically started assembling the thing yet. Why am I like this? Because some of the boning couldn't be inserted after the pieces were sewn together, the pieces were all boned prior to sewing. Almost every single part of this garment was stitched with half back stitches, also known as spaced back stitches. This is a nice harmony between the strength of a full back stitch and the speed of a running stitch. The original garment was whip stitched together, but knowing that to be very difficult to undo after the fact if any alterations needed to be made, I first half back stitched the pieces and then whipped them together at the end of the process. The boning came on a roll, and so did not lie flat in the channels. So after confirming that the stays fit, I stuck the assembled pieces onto my custom dress form and did what I would refer to as waist training for dummies. Dummies. Get it? Sorry. The wrapping helps both by applying pressure to where the shape needs to change, but with a distributed pressure, which doesn't put kinks into the bones. I did a few other parts of the project for the next few days, and then returned to the stays to cover it with the silk fashion fabric. I dyed this silk myself, but I will be going more into that process in a subsequent video. The silk over pieces were shaped differently than the lining. The lining pieces were meant to be worn close to the body and to take the pressure of lacing to make the shape we're after. No matter how loose you lace a boned garment, there is pressure there. The silk overlay is not meant to take any of that pressure, so it is delicately stab stitched, or half back stitched, to as little of the base layer as possible, holding mostly to itself. It was at this point that, still apparently trying to destroy myself, I decided that all of the visible stitching throughout ought to be done with metallic thread for that perfect magical fantasy look. Why does past Liz hate future Liz so much? What did she ever do to her? The metallic thread I have isn't great quality. It was secondhand from somebody's stash. The thread I settled on was 3-ply, and that turned out to be way too bulky for the look I was going for. So instead of choosing a better contrast thread, I opted to unwind the 3-ply thread in sections and sew with a single strand of the thread, having to halt the process periodically to cut another section to unwind. This decision was made on January 23rd. so that's 1 week from the submission deadline. Yep. I have no excuse. One of my most popular early videos is my scope creep video. I specifically tell people not to do this. Why do I do this? Wrangling the overlay pieces into shapes that could be feasibly assembled took a bit of pattern doctoring because I had made adjustments to the lining layer throughout the process, but I managed it, and I began top stitching from the back, moving towards the front on each side. It was at this point that the eyelets became necessary to finish. Once I was done with the overlay fabric, the eyelet holes would be covered with a thin flap of silk to hide them when the garment is laced. 30 eyelet holes, hand-bound, with a turquoise button twist to pay homage to the original bright blue-green of the garment I was reproducing. Okay, now the sleeves. This is well and truly the ultimate procrastination in this project. I talked about it a little in my 1-year anniversary live stream, but to summarize, the sleeves for this gown have absolutely no relation to where arms or shoulders exist on the human body. So when trying to get my bearings of how these sleeves are meant to sit, where they are meant to be stitched, and what changes would produce which results, I was completely lost in the woods. The structure of the sleeves is established with a combination of tight cartridge pleating, a boning channel across the top, and a second one below the pleating, and a layer of pasteboard sandwiched between the lining and the outer fabric in the cartridge pleating. What? These days you probably encounter what is most similar to the pasteboard of ye olde times as the back of sketchbooks and the like, which is exactly where I found mine. The board was way too thick for my use as it was, so I very carefully, and not at all dangerously, sliced the board into 2 layers, and then engaged in some not-so-scientific manipulation to make it a little softer. This is possible with paper and cardboard because the paper pulp fibers loosen the more it is manipulated. With my now softer, shaped pasteboard, I stitched together a layer of linen, a layer of pasteboard, a layer of sturdy but loosely woven gauze, and finally the silk layer together, and tried my best to maintain the cartridge pleating throughout. I admit, this was largely done in a method that I've affectionately named "it'll do." The first sleeve was done in the previous week off camera, but the second sleeve was begun on February 1st. That's 1 day before my deadline. Why? Why? I don't know what I did or how I did it, but I'm pretty sure I sewed the same sleeve twice, instead of one as the mirror of the other. So I had to do some creative covering with the silk, and even my best efforts can't disguise the interesting results. The cuffs, I think, suffered the most by this mistake, as they now sit on very different parts of the sleeve and do not match in shape or size to the degree that they should. The last part of this ensemble are the bodice skirts. These are the cute little wingy things on the bottom of the bodice, which adds a nice little opportunity for decoration, but also further enhances that narrow waist, fluffy skirt silhouette that we're going for. I actually love this little detail on this gown, and I really think it adds to the effect of the time period. These were relatively simple, and I don't have much to say about them, except that I sewed one side with the front skirt on top and the other side with the back skirt on top. And this really pissed me off, because I didn't notice until I started filming at midnight, the night before the submission deadline. But you know what happens when you give yourself absolutely no buffer time to fix mistakes? You've got to live with them. I want to mention at this point that despite the mad dash to the finish and the ill-advised time management of the 10 months that came before this project, I'm not devastated by these mistakes or the overall quality of the finished gown. First of all, even though I know it could be and should be better based on my skills and the original time frame, it's still awesome. I made this by hand in 1 month. That's incredible. One of the benefits, if you can call it that, of my irresponsible fearlessness is that sometimes I really do manage to do something incredible. Second of all is that the overall effect of the gown and its basic bones are solid and, in my opinion, exquisite. I'm so proud of the work I did here. It looks great. Could it have been better? Absolutely. Could I have done a better job with time organization? Of course. But I have never deluded myself into thinking that failure isn't an option. Of course it's an option, especially if your expectations or goals are unrealistic. But the more likely eventuality isn't failure, rather, not quite as good. Not quite is really the watchword of the projects I dive into with reckless abandon. But even the mediocrity born with philosophy, as Miss Austen puts it, eventually becomes its own evil. This project has really demonstrated to me that it's fine and it'll work and fuck it are not statements that I want to be making about the garments that I make. These expressions keep me from the deep, dark sad that would keep me from making garments in the future, but they also keep me from expecting excellence from myself. I want to do better. I want to combine vision with execution. And to do that, I need to be more deliberate and learn more what I can do to motivate myself to look further forward and make better plans for myself. I want "it'll be fine" or "I'll make it work" to be an occasional concession rather than the common cant of my everyday. So over the next month, as I share other parts of this project, I'll explore further the questions and ideas that I have about how to do better and to find a happy medium between the calm of resignation and the elation of genuine accomplishment. And I hope you join me next time. If you liked this video, please subscribe to see more of this kind of content. Donate to my Patreon if you want to support me further in these efforts. Perks include behind-the-scenes video clips, advanced viewing of videos, as well as things like exclusive live streams and voting power for future projects. I also accept Ko-fi donations. Thanks so much for watching. See you soon! I wonder how much that's showing up on video, because my hair is like effectively purple now. Should do something a little crazy with it, like should do another pinup shoot. Oh my god, that would be fun. Should do another pinup shoot. Why am I not doing more pinup shoots? Dang. Okay. All right. I'll see y'all later.